This isn't going to be anything real fancy or formal, but give you a little bit of background on the railroad industry here in Corry. The beginning of the story here in Corry was there was no houses down here at all in the 1850s. Nothing. Bare land, swamp, and forest. In 1835, 36, the state legislature decided, after a lot of people complaining and whatnot, they would put together a proposal for a rail line running from Philadelphia to Erie. Powers that be down that way were the people with the money. So the money was the one that talked. They got to Sunbury up the river, and now they would have to turn and start across the Alleghenies. The money people said, we really don't need to go all that way. We're happy with the trade that we're getting. People up here in the Northwest were looking at it a little bit different perspective. They had no outlet for what they were trying to do. Plus, you had all the commerce on the Great Lakes coming this way. At that point in time, one of the big ports for transport was Dunkirk, New York, which I didn't really realize all that until I put together in the 1890s Moore and Keppel, who built, well, they built Moore and Keppel Lumber and Coal Company down in West Virginia. They started as partners clearing some land out where the Walmart is here in town. And when they got done, they had become good enough friends that Moore, J.B. Moore, said to Keppel, says, hey, you want to go up to Wisconsin with me? I've got some land up there that I bought. We can go timbering together. So they went up there for 2 years. 95% of everything that they cut up there came through Dunkirk, New York, and then on to the Erie Canal, over to the Mohawk, down to New York. So that was the typical transport system, west to east, east to west. So the railroad was going to make that a lot easier. But like I said, the money people said Sunbury, and we don't need to go any further than that. You finally had some influential people up here that got involved in the legislature. They finally convinced enough people to go along with the plan and complete the project. And when they did that, they started building from both ends. And they finished that off, and I believe the Philadelphia and Erie, and these are some of my Bibles, and I've read all of them, but I'm trying to remember the exact dates on some of them. About 1858 is when the Philadelphia and Erie came through here and was completed from one end to the other. Again, still no town here, nothing. Just a swamp that they had come through. You had 3 other gentlemen who decided that they wanted to put together the first railroad where somebody could get on the car in Boston or New York and go all the way to Chicago without having to change cars or trains or companies. And that became the Atlantic and Great Western. Now, these 3 guys were all kind of local, one from Meadville, one from Jamestown. I can't remember where the third one was from. So they got together, formed the Atlantic and Great Western. They leased all the line from New York and Boston to Salamanca, New York. They leased from Meadville to Chicago. In between, they needed to build something. Both of these were all broad gauge, 6-foot broad gauge. So in 59, they started building from Salamanca, and in 60, they were in Jamestown. 61, they came to Corry. Now, where our diamond is here could have been totally different. When the Philadelphia and Erie came through and they were in Warren, there was a lot of controversy of which way they were going to come from Warren this direction. Columbus was a rip-roaring little town. They were wanting them to come through Columbus and have, their businesses thrive and so on. Well, the decision was made to not go this way, go all the way, the route that they took from Warren through Youngsville into Corry. So when the Atlantic and Great Western came along, it ended up crossing down here at Maple Avenue, forming the diamond. And eventually you had both lines with double rails. So you had a double diamond down there, and eastbound, westbound, and so on. Once that diamond formed and transportation was coming through here, you had a broad gauge and a standard gauge. 4 foot, 8.5, 6 foot. You could not interchange cars. So if anything was being switched, you had to do it manually. So down here between Maple Avenue and First Avenue, the loading docks were going on. And being a swamp, we have a street over here called Spring Street. Wonder why it was called a Spring Street? Because the water coming down and then flowed where the tracks are, and down where the loading docks are, there's a photo. The backside of the loading docks were 18 feet off of the bottom of the ground, down on the ground level. In fact, there's a story about a nun that was here in Corry that was being shipped. She died. Her casket was being shipped to Erie for burial out of the cathedral in Erie. All these people marched down with the casket from the church down to the loading docks, and they're up on the loading docks, and the loading docks collapsed. Casket came open, the whole grisly story. But yeah, 18 feet off the ground down to the base. So a lot of water coming through there, muddy. You needed manual labor if you're going to switch anything. So instantly, Main Street was the main street. Center Street didn't exist. You had Meade Avenue was the main one coming this direction. It was going to Spartansburg. It was years later. In fact, there is a photo at the museum taken from the top of the Downer House, which was a hotel down on Washington Street, and it's looking at where the downtown buildings, the old Woolworths and Murphy's buildings, are now. The foundations are poured, and you can see there is no crossing going across the tracks yet. So, their main crossing was Maple Avenue area and Meade Avenue. When the Atlantic and Great Western went through, there's a couple of articles that talk about they made an excursion from Meadville to Jamestown. And the writers that were on there were talking about, this kind of an interesting area. It looks a little rough. They were seeing what was going on down here, and things were changing so rapidly, it became known as Stump City. The stumps were cut. The first mayor in town apparently lived on Mott Street over here, and one of his first actions was, apparently there was a huge stump in the middle of the street, and he wanted that stump removed. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that happened very quickly in this town. This was all happening at the same time that the Civil War was starting, the industrialization was starting, oil was discovered, photography's coming into its own, and the push west was happening. The Civil War had been the first war photographed. The oil business in Titusville was the first birth of an industry to be photographed. So you look at some of the early photos, the photographer, what's Doug's last name? You're up on the hill.
Up on the hill.
Dad has the cars. Across the street from you. Mather.
Oh, Paul.
The photographer's name was Mather in Titusville. He had learned the photography down in the Gettysburg area and then came up here and started his own photography business. His studio was on a barge, a small little barge that he would pole up the river to different petroleum centers and farms where the oil was happening, and he would take photos as he went. He had his dark room inside of this little, and there's a couple of the photos where he is standing in the foreground, and on the other side of the river, there is his shop. And he's got one of his helpers, somebody clicking the button after he's set the whole thing up. It's interesting, but that is the world's first industry where it became photographed as it was happening. The whole thing in Corry, you had those two crossing, things were growing. 59, oil's discovered in Titusville, or drilled for. It had been discovered years before that, but they were finally able to get it in quantity. And at that point in time, the only way to get oil out of there, two ways. There were 1,000 Teamsters in Titusville. They'd load barrels onto a wagon and they would haul it to Garland. Why Garland? Garland was where the Philadelphia and Erie was the closest to Titusville. And that was when they started in 59. There was no Atlantic and Great Western. There was just the Philadelphia and Erie. It was a muddy road. If a horse went down, lame, shoot the horse, pull the leathers, keep on going. So it was kind of an ugly time. The other way to get the oil out was down through Pittsburgh, down the river, down Oil Creek. To go down Oil Creek, they had to load the oil into barges, barrels of oil in barges. Later, they made it an enclosed barge that they would pump into the whole barge. But the original ones were barrels on a barge. Oil Creek is not deep enough for a loaded barge. So upstream, they had two more dams. They had a dam in Titusville and two more dams upstream. If you wanted to get your barge downstream, you better have your barge at the bottom of the dam at noon on Sunday, or on Friday, excuse me. There was one preacher in town who was in charge of all the dams. All the dams were held together by hawser ropes. And you had a dam master at each one with an axe. Preacher would shoot off the gun at noon. You could hear it all the way up the creek. Boom, ropes got chopped. You created a freshet. And the water's coming down and it rises all boats. Down the stream they all go. Well, there's a double arch rock bridge that they all had to go through. There's not much steering on these things and no motor control, so they lost about 25% of the oil every time through the crashes. You had a whole cottage industry of mothers with 7, 8, 9 kids with rags soaking up oil off of the river into barrels, half barrels, and then reselling the oil. I was going to try to bring it today and I forgot about it. There is a painting that was commissioned by J&L Steel Company in Pittsburgh. They did a series of them. And this one shows these barges crashing at this bridge. And I went, there's the beginning of the Oil Creek Railroad. And that's why the Oil Creek Railroad was started from here, right on the other side of Main Street. And the reason they put that was to get the oil out to the closest intersection of two rail lines The civil engineer that was in charge of the Atlantic and Great Western, when they got to Corry before they got to Meadville, he took a horse and headed to Titusville to see what was going on, laid out a route, and took them 1 year to build the Oil Creek, down the Oil Creek. So it went out of town, up the east side of one of the branches of French Creek, till it gets almost to what they call Summit. If you're going to Spartansburg on 77, there is a road that takes off at an angle called Short Road. That was their rail track because they did not want to try to go over the mountain, over the hill. It wasn't a mountain per se, but they wanted to go around it. So it takes off and goes out almost to Lindsay Hollow, turns around and comes back on the other side of the summit, crosses what is now the road, 77, and joins up alongside of, now you're on French Creek on this side of the summit, you're on Patrick Run on this side of the summit, and it follows Patrick Run down to Spartansburg and into Clear Lake. From Clear Lake, coming out of Clear Lake, you are on Oil Creek. And so the railroad went all the way up there, down Patrick Run, and on down Oil Creek into Titusville, and then out to Petroleum Center and so on. And later they changed the name a couple or 3 years later to the Oil Creek and not Franklin. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. And the name changed, the ownership changed. They added in a couple of little branches off to the side. And at that point, up until that point, the majority of the oil was coming here either to be shipped east, or at that same time, another thing that was happening, lighting. Here in the United States, there was no electricity. Lighting, for the most part, was sperm whale oil. It was the cleanest burning fuel. So you wouldn't get soot. You'd see the pictures of the old kerosene lamps, oil lamps up, and you see a little cupola above them. That's to keep the soot off the ceiling. So trying to come up with a replacement for that, knowing that they did know that, hey, the whale industry was going downhill. They were losing a lot of whales. And the largest seller of sperm whale oil in the United States was a man by the name of Downer in Boston. And he had gone to England, and he found a guy in England who had patented a refining process making kerosene out of petroleum. He bought U.S. rights, and then he sent a guy here to the area, to Titusville, to find a good place to refine. And of course, you got the intersection of now 3 railroads coming in. You got the Oil Creek coming from Titusville. You got the Philadelphia and Erie east-west. You got there, up to Erie, the lakes, and now you've got the Atlantic and Great Western east to west going through here. So he decided this was where it is. Their tank farm was a block and a half over here. If you know where the old Ajax plant was, down along the side of the rails, that was where Downer Petroleum was. If you're coming up First Avenue, both sides were company houses. And if anybody who was around in the 60s, if you were looking up First Avenue, you'd see this big square 2-story house up there. That was the Downer supervisor's house. And then they had a hotel, which was down Washington Street. So with that, all this oil coming in here, the majority of it was going to Downer. I've got a photo of them building 4 large, I don't know how many 1,000-gallon tanks they were, steel tanks, right down here, a block away. And then kerosene was being shipped out. It didn't take very long for them to start building refineries down in Rouseville, down in that area. And so pretty soon The Downer Petroleum was kind of defunct out of it, although they were making kerosene. Stuff was being done differently. Mostly, some of it was going to medicines and so on, going down to Rouseville. From that time frame, the Atlantic and Great Western, which was broad gauge, they began converting over to standard gauge to come, be able to take cars from the Philadelphia and Erie and from whatever other railroad and be able to take it down to Titusville and back. There is a drawing. Well, it's not a drawing. It's an etching, a steel etching that was. I mean, they didn't have halftone processes for being able to print photographs in magazines and whatnot back then. It looks like a drawing, but it's really a steel etching and then stamped. There is one that is taken from a photograph that is, the photographer is on the top of a boxcar just about next to the Climax plant over here, looking east down the tracks. On the right-hand side, you can see the Downer plant over here. You can distinguish the broad gauge and the standard gauge. On the right-hand side, there is a separate track, broad gauge. What that did, Oil Creek needed to have maintenance facilities. Well, they didn't have any place down here really, but there is a street in town, clear out past McKenna Steel, called Railroad Street. That is where the Oil Creek Railroad's maintenance shops were. There was a separate broad gauge line that went all the way out there. It did not connect onto the main lines until it got out there. There is a photo of the old two-story MS building down at Maple Avenue, and then you see that track on the right-hand side going out there. Actually, there's a car in the 40s parked on the tracks, still going out there. I've never found maps or anything else of that facility. Only seen it mentioned a couple of places. So I knew that it did exist, but you never know. Over the period of time, they wanted to get stuff in and out of Buffalo, and they would have to either come over to Erie and down. So they ended up building, another company ended up building the Buffalo, Corry, Pittsburgh Railroad, which came out of Dunkirk, Mayville, Clymer, into Corry. This little dip down here, the bottom of that dip is the track bed for the Buffalo, Corry, and Pittsburgh Railroad. They would have to swing out onto the main line and back into the station. This was in the early 1900s. At that same time, we had a Corry Columbus trolley that went on Center Street from the tracks out to Columbus Avenue, turned and went out to Columbus to take people out. There was a dam out there, Columbus Dam, and there was a park out there, so people would go out and fish or boat, or they had some concessions out there. I've got pictures of my grandmother and about 10 other ladies sitting, pretending they're fishing on a pier out there. That trolley, when it got out to Columbus Avenue and turned, about 150 feet away was the Buffalo, Corry, Pittsburgh Railroad, and they had a little ticket office there. So it would always stop at the ticket office coming into town. Anybody that was doing business in downtown Corry would jump off, run over, get on the trolley, and they could be in town doing business well before the train would get in and back into the station. So there's back and forth. The trolley was originally built for the one purpose of taking people to the racetrack. Snyder Circle, which was a World War II low-income housing thing that was built out there, that was where the original Corry racetrack was. a little longer than Snyder Circle. It extended further this direction. And that the races were held for a couple or 3 weeks a year, and people would come in on the train, and so that's why the trolley went right to the tracks. They could get on and go out there. The maintenance shops for the trolley were where the Napa store is, going north on Center Street, out past the YMCA on the left-hand side. There's a little bridge right there, and they were right next to that bridge. Something that most people don't realize, Pennsylvania Railroad took over a lot of stuff. Philadelphia area was part of one of their acquisitions. The Atlantic and Great Western became part of the Erie Railroad. The Buffalo, Corry, and Pittsburgh, I think, got tied in with the Erie, but it also had multiple. New York Central used it. There was a lot of different usages going on it. When the Pennsylvania Railroad was here in town, they needed to do maintenance like any place else. Oil Creek Railroad was kind of defunct. They purchased that line, and where the tracks of the Oil Creek shoot off over on the other side down on Main Street, that became their maintenance yard. There was we don't know for exact because I've never found a good set of drawings or photos on it yet, but there's about a 6 to 7 car roundhouse in there and turntable. And if you look at an aerial photograph, you can see where the turntable was. The foundations for their maintenance shops are still there. I was on top of them back in the early 2000s. Most of it is covered with dirt and debris, and there's 6-inch diameter trees growing on top of it now. But they're still there. This is the property, anybody that's familiar with it over there, the Dowell sand silos are on that property. If you're at the silos and looking at the tracks, the turntable is just to your right and towards the tracks. What's left in there, I don't know. I have one friend of mine that thinks that he was involved with pushing in the sides of the pit, but he isn't sure. He was a young truck driver and excavator at that time and working for somebody else, just doing what he was told. What people also don't know most times, and I've only found one map that shows the rails. If you are familiar with the Catholic Church right over here, behind the Catholic Church, adjacent to this track, there was a Y for turning engines. Franklin Street was the Y. The Y went all the way down either to Mott Street or halfway between Mott and Center Street. And then they could pull back out and head back to Buffalo, going forward, not backwards. In the football field area behind the Catholic Church, they had a roundhouse there. I've only seen one photograph of it. It burned down. After it burned down, they took 6 engines and put on the tracks as if they were in the barn and took a picture of it. Buzz Hammond has the photo, but he has not been able to find it since they made their move from one office to a new office. But he has that photo. And I mean, the first time I looked at it, what is this? Where is this? And then start looking at backgrounds and you can see the hills over here. And I'm like, okay, that's where it's at. Now, what their access was, I can only imagine that their access point would have been off of the Y. They would have had to pull down on the Y and then come back in, because with a Y there kind of surrounding it, you couldn't really easily make a shunt coming into the turntable. From that point, going forward, I mean, in the early 1900s, this was a major rail hub. If you go back and search records from the New York Times, the Buffalo papers, you will find articles in there saying, westbound passenger train, New York Central is stuck in Corry with snow. I mean, there's several of these articles I've come across. So, I mean, it was not an uncommon occurrence. When that happened, we had through Corry something like 32 trains a day coming through Corry. As a kid, I remember them coming in on the from Mayville area, the Buffalo, Corry, Pittsburgh, coming through at 2 in the morning. There was whistles going all night long. And along with that, you heard in the background the pumps running at the Corry Waterworks and the hammers going at McInnes Steel. And I mean, this was quite the industrial hub. Like I say, if you go down here and you go across the tracks today, I think you can count maybe 8 tracks going across there. There were 18. There's still remnants. You go into the woods and you'll find remnants for all kinds of shunts and sidings down in there. World War II. Yes.
Not being from the area, how busy is this line now?
One train going to Meadville, or no, to Erie and back every day or two. Up until a year ago, I don't know what changed, but up until a year ago, it was about 2 a week. It would just make the run from Olean to Erie. And they'd go through about 9 or 10 in the morning, sometimes 8. They would be hauling foam for Corry Foam. And then they would head on up to Erie. And then about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, you'd hear them coming back through. A couple of years prior to that, you still had the Western New York and Pennsylvania running into Jamestown and then through Corry and Meadville. And the same kind of thing. You'd get it coming one direction in the morning and heading back in the afternoon. I think that line's been down for 2 years. It's not abandoned. They've just kind of put it on hold, but I also know from a friend of mine that there has never been any official notification of FRA, Federal Rail Authority, that they are not running. They just told the 1 or 2 customers they had, we aren't coming. Say that again?
What engine companies run that?
Genesee, Wyoming. The world's largest short line railroad. Australia, all over the place. Yeah, it's all orange with same circle, just different wording. Yeah, Genesee and Wyoming, and what we were hoping to have happen this weekend, and this planning goes back to last fall. We have a donor originally from Erie who graduated from Allegheny, Meadville, who ended up getting into finance and now lives in Dallas, Texas. Has been on the board of directors of 2 or 3 railroads and small lines. Was on the board of directors of Rail America up until the point in time that they sold their assets. They were the world's largest short line. They sold it to Genesee and Wyoming, making them the world's largest. So he is highly involved in financial markets. He needs to stay in touch all the time. When he was on one of these boards, up for sale came the 13-car executive fleet from CSX. That fleet, the car that he bought, was an original fleet car that went to a line up in Minnesota and then it was on New York Central, and then it was on Amtrak, and then CSX ended up with it, and then they disbanded that fleet. He bought it 20 years ago, 22 years ago, and has been restoring it ever since in Texas. It's a Pullman observation car. Now, observation doesn't mean a dome on top. Observation just means you got bigger windows and maybe a deck on the back and a lounge. Okay, this has the deck on the back. It has a lounge, very nicely appointed 10, 12 person lounge, 4 bedrooms, dining room for 10 or 12, full kitchen, and porter's room for 2. He, at one point in time, he was having the trucks redone, trying to get to his final inspections for Amtrak, because all these cars have to be hauled by Amtrak unless you have them by freight. And then I don't know what the deal is, whether they're allowed to have passengers on them or not, if they're registered with freight on Freight or not. But so he had the crew from Union Pacific, Cheyenne, was down there for 2 weeks redoing the trucks on the Pullman. And those got done. He had 2 more years of working on cabinetry inside that he was working on. And then he called me up and he said, hey, you know, my car is going to go up to Cleveland to be painted. If you guys can figure out a way to do, you know, have some kind of a function, a fundraiser or whatever, more than welcome to use it. So it came down to trying to figure out, how do we get it here? And other people said, well, why don't you just do it near here? Do it Northeast or, you know, wherever. I want to do it here. You know, it's our fundraiser. It's not Northeast fundraiser. And trying to work things out. I had one of the vice presidents on the Genesee in Wyoming. He and I had a great 2-hour conversation. He was driving someplace, and he's into restoration at a little town somewhere down south central PA. And says, well, write it all up for me, send it to me. Never heard another word. Never returned a phone call. Never returned anything. Last week I was here one day and I kept hearing this clang, 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 and somebody's burglar alarm going off, like at Rogers over here or whatever. I got ready to leave and I pull out and I look down and I can see the lights blinking down here, and get down there. Well, the thing's been stuck on all day. Bing, 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 bing. So I have his phone number, so I texted him. Well, he was on vacation down in West Virginia or whatever. Next morning I had a note back. Thanks for the call, got a crew on the way. So apparently nobody had called or said anything. So anyway, that was supposed to be scheduled. We were trying to get it to happen for this weekend, get it in here for a Wednesday night, and then do 2 dinners a night for about 20 people each. You know, a 5 o'clock seating and an 8 o'clock seating, and catered and so on. For 3 nights, try to get them involved, because there is a regulation to where all these companies have to have safety programs for the public. And I can't remember the name of it, but there is an official federal name on it. And they have an engine that is painted with the crossings, yellow with black, you know, crossing tracks and so on it, for the safety program they're required to do for school kids and industrial people and whatever. And we invited them, hey, bring one of your engines down, bring a crew down, put on a thing. You can write off your requirement for having done this. Didn't go anywhere. I had a note back, and I hadn't heard from the owner down in Texas since last December. So he wrote me the other day. He said, "Well, I should be coming to get that car out of up there if you can figure out a way." So it's still in Cleveland, but it was being taken back to original Pullman colors, and I have no doubt that it is immaculate. He was having the kitchen completely modernized, updated, and he had 3 Wi-Fi connections, satellite connections, whatever, so that no matter where he goes, he's he's in contact with the market, so on.
You probably don't have any idea he's doing it for in Cleveland.
It was at the CSX yard. There's a paint shop and a different company's paint shop there in the CSX yard.
On the east side. We're from Cleveland.
Okay. Yeah, I've never been there, but I looked it up myself trying to figure out, okay, where is this thing? And I think the CSX yard's on this side of Cleveland.
Yeah.
And somewhere in their complex. And I mean, thing I came across was a bunch of photos, and I don't know if I want my engine or car in there because all these things are graffitied. So obviously it's inside somewhere. But yeah, I'd love to have had it come here and maybe sometime, but if it doesn't happen this time, I doubt that it'll ever make it back. But we were talking about some possibilities of future things. He asked, "Well, what are you guys going to do with this thing when you get it running?" Well, we're going to get it running, and what are you going to run it on? You're going to take it down to East Broad Top? Probably not, because down there we'd have to be FRA compliant and boiler. We're getting a new boiler built. It's being built up in Maine locomotive. We were hoping to have it back here by now, but it's not. We took the original boiler up there, and we took 40 parts that all bolt on and attach, so make sure it all fits. We don't want to have something come back here. We go to try to put it on, the hole's off by 1/8 of an inch. So everything will fit when they're done with it up there. Trying to think what else. On the engine, getting the engine running. There aren't very many places that have 3-foot gauge. If you happen to look over underneath the shelves over there, there are the axles and the wheels. 3-foot gauge. And if you look at the wheels, they are 6-inch wide tramway wheels. What's a tramway wheel? A tramway wheel is designed, it can run on steel, but it's also designed to run on 6x6 wood. Now, sometimes they would put a piece of hardwood on top of that. Sometimes they would put a piece of strapped steel on top. But in the woods, on the Climax A, they'd go through, throw down some logs, spike down 6x6s and run on them. And when they're done, there's their firewood for the next place. And then there was a different set of wheels that was called pole wheels. And if you take a modern day wheel, take the tire off of it and look at it at the end, you see the 2 sides, and then you see the part where the inner tube or the air is. Well, that's the shape of the pole wheel. And when they say pole, it means like a 6 to 8-inch diameter tree. So they cut down straight 6 to 8-inch diameter trees, trim all the branches off, bark them, debark them, and then put them down on the ties and spike them down, big end to big end, small end to small end, and these wheels ran right on top of the poles. And you had your standard 3-inch wheels for normal steel. When this engine was going up to Nome for the gold rush, this was the second engine being shipped up there to the Wild Goose Railroad, which was part of the Wild Goose Mining and Trading Company. The first one went up in 1900. Ours went up in 1902, and at the same time, number 315, which was built right behind it on the line, was going up there also. Ours was going out to Council 85 miles out of Nome. So when they dropped it off out in the ocean, onto a barge to haul up the river to Council, then the ship continued on up to Nome, and 315 went into Nome to join the other Climax 212. And 2 years later, they ordered another one, number 399. So there were 4 Climax A's up there. Ours was the only one out in Council, had its own 8 miles of track. And the whole purpose of that engine was to haul in dredge parts. They had the richest 3 claims in all of the gold rushes. Not that an area didn't produce more gold than up there, but their claims produced more. They went over the claim twice with the dredge and got almost as much the second time through as they got the first time. And I mean, there's piles of rubble and back up in there that's like that. And at that point in time, the railroad, the 8 miles that this car was on, was the world's northernmost railroad. There's 3 more further north now, like over in Russia and one of the Scandinavians. But yeah, where this was at, you didn't run them in the winter. It's about a 4 to 5 months, 4.5 month work season. Everything had to happen in 4.5 months, and there was also the land of the midnight sun, and that was the time of the year. Ice would go out of the creeks about June, and your snow would start in October. So that's when your work happened. A lot of the people would leave and go down to Seattle or San Francisco for the winter, and then back on the first ship coming back. In the meantime, the engine sits there doing nothing because you've got 8, 10, 12 feet of snow, 80 mile an hour winds, minus 60 degrees, just sitting there. So this engine was used. We figured that the reason they got it was to haul dredge parts in. You couldn't float a whole dredge in. Had to be parted out. Everything was piece by piece. So they hauled parts in from 1902 until 1906. And then they completed the assembly by 1908, and it became active in 1908 and remained active until about 1923. And the amount of gold, not very many other miners were even working out there at that point in time. They just kept on going. Like I say, 2 passes, and the engine ended up being abandoned at the end of the track where the mines were, not where the headquarters was. Why? We don't know. Nothing written. I've got a couple of guesses, but don't know for sure. There was a couple of parts missing we found, but that could have been taken by anybody. The builder plate was one of the parts that was missing. We knew it was missing when we got it. 3 years later, I was in the Navy Seabees. A pair of twins who were in Vietnam in the Seabees, different battalions at the same time I was. One of them at age 14 had removed the builder plate and had protected it ever since. Rumor was that it was bolted onto the wall of one of the bars in Nome, and tried to run that down, and everybody told me, well, I think was the Polaris. I think it was on the bar. The Polaris is where the Iditarod ended. And 3 months prior to me figuring this out, it burned to the ground. So I'm finding photos of the fire and photos of the aftermath, and I'm looking, and windows are out, and looking into the bar, I can see stuff on the wall that hadn't melted. Well, it's not 2,000 degrees, so I'm figuring maybe the bronze survived. One picture, the guy that took his bulldozer out and hauled our engine back in died years ago. Actually lived longer than the family that we got it from. His son took over the company, an excavation company. Here's his son on the excavator demoing the building that we're wondering whether the builder plate's in. Well, that year we went got up there to Nome and met with him and met with his sister, who's their family historian. She worked for the city of Nome for 34 years. Anything that came through with anything to do with railroads, she had copies of. And we're over at her place sitting on the floor at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, and went to pizza for dinner at 10. And she just keeps bringing out boxes of stuff. And it's like, oh my God, this is overload, too much. And I said to her, I said, Cussy, that was her nickname. She got at age 4 by the guys in her dad's shop. Yeah, there's a pretty good story behind that one. Anyway, I said, we've heard a rumor that the builder plate for this engine might have been on the wall of a bar somewhere in Nome. And I said, I also heard that it might have been the Polaris, which burned down. And she looked at me, and all she said was, you need to talk to Stan Anderson. Okay, well, I look over, I'm staying with an ex-CB for 3 days, and he ran the water company for 20 years and was retiring 2 months later. And he and I had been talking about various things, and there were 2 or 3 other CBs up in the area up there. One of them was Stan Anderson, who had been mayor of Nome for a while and was on the council for 15 years or whatever. And we had talked about him, because he was a CB. I looked over at Toby, and Toby got this shit-eating grin. And okay. So the VFW up there has 1 dinner a night. They're only open 1 night, and you better get there early because there are only, whatever the entree is going to be, there's only so many of them. If they got 40 steaks, you better be there to get your order in and pay for your steak, or you're drinking your dinner. Because there is no second option, and there's not a lot of bar food. So we get there early and we get our order, and all of a sudden Toby says, oh, come here. We're up getting a beer. And he said, need to meet this guy. Here's Stan Anderson. So we get BSing a little bit about our Vietnam experience, and he said, why don't you come over and join us for dinner? He came over, sat down, and about 20 minutes later, I said, hey, Cussy told me I needed to talk to you. What about? As well, she told me, I asked her, and I told him the same story, that it might be on the wall of a bar, and maybe it was the Polaris and whatnot. And he just looked at me and he says, it was never on the wall in the Polaris. Okay. He says, it was on the wall in my bar, the Bering Sea. Well, it wasn't, he didn't own it. He was the manager, bartender. But all of his memorabilia was covering the walls in there. And it was mounted right above the bell. Anybody that struck gold or had something, you rang the bell and you're buying around and whatever. And he looked at me, I said, whoa, really? He said, yeah, but I sold the bar. Okay, did you keep the memorabilia? Oh yeah, I've still got it. But I don't know where it's at. I haven't seen her about 6 years. Okay, where might it be? Well, I got a lot of stuff stored in a van over at the VFW and whatnot. I'll take a look. When I find it, I'll let you know. 2 years later, I get the phone call. It says, I found it. What did you find? Oh, that button. That's what he called it. It was a button. What are you talking about? Oh, the front, the number plate. Oh, where did you find it? He said, well, my twin brother, we both have the same health issues, and he lives in Eagle River, actually, outside of Anchorage. And that's where Keith lived, that had the engine for 34 years. He says, I was down there for a doctor's appointment, so I stayed with my brother and his wife. And he says, we're having dinner, and I said, hey, Steph, do you remember what happened to that button? And again, what button are you talking about? You know, that plate. Oh, yeah, I know exactly where it's at. Where is it? Well, when they sold the bar and you got all your stuff, he says, I was there helping you with some of that, and you said, here, put this out at the cabin. They still had the old family cabin out in Council. So here it was next to the fireplace in his brother's cabin out in Council. Well, then the conversation became, well, I don't know if I want to give it to him. We told Keith that if he ever got the engine running, then we give it back. I wrote him back a letter. I said, hey, that's 25 years ago, and we're all getting older, and I want this thing with the engine, not wait and get it tied up with a family dispute and everything else. So the next trip up, we were presented the builder plate. So end of story. Any questions?
Where's the plate at? Don't tell me you don't know.
Sandy, would you reach in that right-hand gray drawer and get the black bag with the builder plate, please? Had to think.
Yeah.
We do have replicas. One of the replicas is over on the table there. It's solid brass, $1,000. And it's got an inscription on the back recognizing Steph, the top drawer, that one. Okay, there. The black right there, that black case. So yeah, on the back of that plate, there is a CNC'd in inscription honoring Stephen Stan. That is the original. Climax B's and C's had one on each side of the boiler. Climax A's only had one. It was on the number plate on the front of the boiler. And the 4 holes, when they mounted these on there, they clamped them and just hand drilled the holes. So they were not off of a template or anything else. And so when they went to put this on the wall, they didn't line up 4 more holes, and they aren't even square. That's the story, and I'm original, or not the original, the replica. Feel the weight difference between these two.
Lay it down.
Huh?
Lay it down.